Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We will be recapping the Week 7 NFL action with an eye towards Week 8. After 6 teams on bye in Week 7, fantasy managers can rejoice because there are no teams on bye for this upcoming week. But as we'll get to with all these game previews, we can call this blowout week. There are many heavy favorites in this one. Ryan, why don't you talk to us about a Thursday night football matchup that is already projecting to be highly lopsided?
The Bills will host the Buccaneers, Josh. The Bills are 7.5-point favorites, 42.5 game total. It's been a rough 3 weeks for Buffalo now. 2 weeks ago, they barely escaped Tyrod Taylor's Giants. The defense played well. The offense struggled. This week, it was the opposite against the Patriots. The defense, Mac Jones had a pretty good game. Offense was all right. It didn't really take off a little bit till the end, so maybe we're concerned about both units there. That said, Josh, there was some positives here for fantasy players. Tell us about Dalton Kincaid's usage in this matchup.
So first off, Dawson Knox is going to get wrist surgery. Very, very unclear timetable, so we'll be looking more into that as more details come out. In terms of Kincaid for Week 7, it was the most routes that he'd run since Week 1. It was his third game where he was targeted on at least 22% of his routes. That's kind of good. But it's not all rosy for him. Kincaid has still not had more than 37 total air yards in any game this year. He still ran just 69% as many routes as Stephon Diggs in Week 7. He just feels like he remains in this kind of top 12 fantasy tight end conversation, depending on matchup. Maybe things change with Knox out, but I'd say right now we should still treat him as an upside bench stash. And I kind of want to see what the usage looks like with Knox out, because ultimately, if he's going to be running 70% of the routes at a very, very low average depth of target, it doesn't matter how good the offense is. It doesn't matter how athletic he is. The floor is simply going to be too low for him to be an enticing weekly option.
That's Jay Larky tweets. As Josh mentioned, there's a lot of significant favorites this week. Could be a lot of blowouts in store. So with that in mind, I've started writing up survivor pool previews on Monday. We can't make any decisions until later in the week till injury reports are finalized, but can get you a good primer there. And then later in the week on Friday, Saturday, we'll finalize our thoughts on that in Discord. Now, Josh, the Buccaneers, as you know, not a big fan of the Buccaneers. Last week's narrow loss to Atlanta is kind of what I was expecting from Baker Mayfield and company. The defense is good. We've been saying that for weeks. The running game is non-existent for the second year in a row now. And, at the end of the day, Baker Mayfield, he's played relatively well this year. Let's give him some credit where credit's due. But he's not a guy that can carry an NFL offense with any kind of consistency. You have any thoughts on the Buccaneers offense, Josh?
So I actually have an article on the33rdteam.com, free to read. It just dropped this afternoon, Monday. And I kind of detail why we should not be particularly excited about games that the Buccaneers play in, not just for the Buccaneers offense, but the team that is facing the Buccaneers as well. Because one thing that I think is becoming apparently clear this season is that which teams are playing really, really matters. And that while, yes, there's individual fantasy players, they all exist within the ecosystem of that game. And I detail 2 teams that we should be excited about, and 2 teams we should be less excited about. The Buccaneers, one of the teams that I am simply not particularly excited about. And I would actually downgrade all the Bills very, very slightly, given that they are playing not just on Thursday night, but against one Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Next up, Josh, Giants versus Jets. If the Giants lost to the Commanders last week, Josh, I would have showed up with a paper bag on my head. No question about it. They lose to the Jets this week, I might do the same thing. Giants are 2.5-point home underdogs. Kind of not really a home team because they both play in the same stadium. Both fan bases will be about 50-50 split. Totals of a borderline gruesome 36.5 for this early in the week with no weather being involved. Giants defense continues to play well. A drop pick 6, a fumbled punt that made the game look closer than it was against Washington. We couldn't have asked for much more out of Tyrod Taylor behind an injury-ravaged Giants offensive line. Big thing here is Wan'Dale Robinson and Jalen Hyatt looks like they could be long-term difference makers for New York. What are your thoughts on Hyatt now in fantasy football?
I don't want to be the pessimistic guy, but I'm going to be the pessimistic guy. I'm just not that excited still. So in this game, Jalen Hyatt ran about 80% of the routes compared to Darren Waller and Darius Slayton. He ran twice as many routes as Isaiah Hodgins. That's great. All right, cool. He leapfrogged him, but about the same amount of routes as Wandale. This was a productive game for Hyatt. He had 168 air yards this past week. That's 36 more air yards than any other Giants player has had in a game this year. But not that we should have expected this. However, the Commanders have been, I've caught them a couple times, the big play factory on defense, where if there was going to be more of a Hyatt game than, say, a Wandale game, it would be a team like the Commanders that has been allowing big play after big play after big play. So, of course, the guy that operates much farther downfield in Hyatt was much more of the game plan. Ultimately, Hyatt has 2 games above 21 yards this year, 2 out of 7. He hasn't reached 11 PPR fantasy points in a game yet. He's only topped 2 targets in a game twice. The target share hasn't hit 19% in a game yet. And then we remember that this is also the Giants offense, and that anything that involves a target share, a route share, we need to be very skeptical, given again that it's the Giants offense. Jalen Hyatt, to me, simply a bench stash. And I wouldn't even say that he's one of the better wide receiver bench stashes at this point, just given the Giants offense.
Our waiver wire guru, Nick Boderford, and I are a little bit more optimistic on Jalen Hyatt as a bench stash, but I got to be honest with you, Josh. It not only hurt my feelings with the Giants talk, but it hurt my feelings because it was reality. The reality of the situation is Hyatt's upside is capped by the offense. We'll talk about that more on our waiver wire show tomorrow. Let's go to the Jets here, Josh. The Jets are coming off their bye, had a big win against Philly. The defense carries this team against everyone. They beat Buffalo behind it. They beat Philly behind it. They give Patrick Mahomes Chiefs everything they could handle with Taylor Swift in attendance on Sunday Night Football a few weeks ago. They'll have a trench advantage against the Giants here, especially if the Giants have all these offensive line injuries that they've been dealing with. You know, that's the thing, too, here. If Big Blue goes into this game down Thomas, their left tackle, down Neal, their right tackle, down their rookie center Schmidt, this game literally has breakaway potential for the Jets defense. The Giants could genuinely get shut out. That said, Josh, the Jets offense isn't exactly a beacon of reliability. Do you have any thoughts on that group?
I'd say the guy that we should be looking at here is Breece Hall, someone that I want to trade for. The Giants have allowed numerous massive fantasy point opportunities to running backs this year, given that the run defense isn't very good, and given that the Giants simply can't score points, so game script has not been in their favor. I think that's about all we can say there, is that Garrett Wilson, just a locked and loaded wide receiver, 20 to 30 each week, depending on the matchup, which doesn't really crush you, doesn't help you, especially when you took him in round 1 or early round 2. I'd say that's just a net negative if he looks like a pure flex play at this point. Breece Hall is the one guy where the role has grown tremendously. 2 games ago, he got almost all the carries, was splitting pass game work with Michael Carter. And then the week before the bye, he kept most of the carries, but then essentially just grabbed and is probably not going to let go of the pass game work from Michael Carter. Breece Hall should have a top 5, top 6 running back role moving forward. Given that it's the Jets, I'd say he's probably more of the RB10 type rest of season. But I think we should just be generally very optimistic about Breece Hall. Anyone that was getting him in the 4th and 5th round of fantasy cannot be disappointed with a guy that's going to be getting around 15 carries and 4 to 6 targets per game moving forward.
This also sounds like we should be done with Dalvin Cook now, right?
Yeah, at this point, Dalvin Cook looks like he is in a committee with Michael Carter for who the running back 2 is. And I simply do not like committee backs vying for the backup role on a Zach Wilson offense.
It's Jay Larky tweets. Next up, Josh. Panthers versus Texans. The battle of the 1st overall pick versus the 2nd overall pick. Both teams are coming off their bye this week. Thomas Brown takes over play calling duties from Frank Reich for Carolina. Obviously, the Panthers are hoping that sparks Bryce Young's career. Bryce Young struggled mightily even through the first 6 games of his young career, but he's shown some flashes. He's made one of the things that I like about him is he's made some good decisive decisions where that's a big difference maker. Back to the Giants real quick. We've seen Tyrod Taylor make a little bit of margin with that. Obviously, we expect more out of Bryce Young than Tyrod Taylor long term, but this is a tough matchup for them because Houston, CJ Stroud has been on the other side of the spectrum as far as rookie quarterbacks go. He's been historically efficient through his first 6 games. And, none of us went into the season thinking Houston had a great offensive supporting cast. And then on top of that, the Texans defense has showed out a couple times too. So Houston, and we bet on their win total early in the offseason, Josh, 5.5 wins. We already got 3 on the board with a bye weekend. We're looking good there. We're looking good there. Give us some thoughts on this game in general, either team.
So we'll start with the Panthers. all the reports are that there's going to be some type of committee with Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard. And this is kind of why we were just not very excited about Miles Sanders in fantasy this year. And ultimately, potentially the most impressive running back game of the season for them was week 6 before the bye, when Chuba had full reins over the backfield, was quite efficient on the ground, decently involved through the air. I'd expect kind of a 1A, 1B where Sanders is the 1A at their current prices. There's not really much you can do. Chuba's price is inflating. Sanders is plummeting. I would say that if you have either of these guys, you simply have to hold them. And one thing you've kind of been preaching is that the Panthers have a better schedule now that the bye has come and go. Hopefully the play calling improves and the quality of opponents will drop a little bit. So I think we can be just a little bit more optimistic, even though it sounds like a committee with a bad offense. And then on the Texans side, I really did not like that Dameon Pierce was outproduced by Devin Singletary on the ground the week before the bye. The one thing that we had been generally optimistic on was that Dameon Pierce was the far better runner. And now I'm just not even sure if that's true. And in an offense like this, where it's clear that it's going to be funneled through Stroud and generally 3 receiver sets, we do not like a running back committee there either. So not a whole lot of positives to take away from this game for fantasy. I'd say this is more of, if you are a dynasty community member, which I know a lot of people are, this is an exciting game to watch between Young and Stroud, and just simply seeing which of these pieces look viable long-term, whether that's Jonathan Mingo on the Panthers, whether that is Nico Collins or Tank Dell on the Texans.
If you have any trade questions, start sits, waiver wire questions, you can follow me at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter, and my pinned tweet is linked to our Discord. Now, Josh, next up, Commanders versus Eagles. Spreads Commanders plus 6.5, totals 43.5 points. Big update here for the Eagles. They just traded for Titans safety Kevin Byard. For the love of God, please stop giving Howie Roseman quality veterans. This team's already stacked up enough. They don't need to, the one hole they really have as an organization right now is a safety position. They got a former Pro Bowler now. Washington took the Eagles to overtime a couple of weeks ago in Philadelphia with a 34-31 score. Sam Howell's had a few surge games this year so far. He had one against the Broncos where he came back on them. He even had one against the Bears, although a lot of that came in garbage time. That said, Josh, and we talk about this every week, and it's not changing, he continues to get sacked at historic rate. Eagles will have a major trench advantage to the point it could significantly impact play calling in this game. A lot of quick hitters, probably lean on the run game, which, was disappointing against the Giants last week. However, when the Commanders beat Philadelphia last year, it was driven through their run game. A little bit of a different scenario here with Jordan Davis and the dynamic athlete Jalen Carter in the interior for Philadelphia. But, Washington has their hands full again here, but they have played the Eagles tough. You have anything to say about the Commanders, Josh?
I will just talk more about the Commanders' defense, because ultimately I think what we're going to see is a much more lopsided victory in favor of the Eagles than what we saw in their first meeting. Ultimately, as I mentioned before, the Commanders are a pass defense to target. One thing we've gotten in our Discord that you have mentioned before, throw your trade questions, we'll help you with fantasy advice, start sits, prop bets, etc., is a lot of people out there want to trade away Devonta Smith. And I would strongly caution people against that, because A, he's a talented player, and B, they're about to face the Commanders. If anything, this feels like a sell low where you wait 1 week. And if you really, really are sick of the volatility of Devonta Smith, you wait 1 more week. The thing I'll say about the Eagles offense is that we talk about this a lot. They can just beat you in so many ways. One thing I loved last night is that they're really run heavy. The run game's really working with Swift. He's breaking off chunk plays. And then all of a sudden, the Dolphins start to look fairly competent with their defensive front. Swift and Gainwell keep getting stuffed at the line of scrimmage. So they say, you know what? That is totally okay with us. We will simply pass the ball a lot more, and very successfully. It's a team where I still don't think we've seen the full ceiling game on offense yet. So I really just wouldn't want to trade away any Eagles in fantasy at this point.
That makes sense. I thought last week might have been a good opportunity for Devonta Smith, but he limped into Sunday with some injuries. So I'm interested to see what he does against a very beatable Commanders secondary myself. I picked the Eagles to win on Sunday night, but their defense exceeded my expectations. They'll be third in my power rankings this week, unless San Francisco loses tonight, or unless Minnesota gives them a real scare. I might get cute there too, Josh, in that scenario. That said, just in general, you said Philly can beat you in so many different ways. Jalen Hurts gets the benefit of being able to hold the ball for a very long time, and he takes advantage of it big time. Gives him time to extend plays more often than most quarterbacks. He broke off a few big runs last night too. And, as we all know, and this is a pretty heavily talked about topic in football in general, those 4th and 1 scrum plays, Jalen Hurts' power and explosiveness with the Eagles' offensive line, it's basically like a free 4th and 1 every single time they deploy it. Like you said, Swift continues to look like an upgrade over Miles Sanders. A.J. Brown has been ridiculous in recent weeks. You talked about Devonta Smith. You got anything else about the Eagles, Josh?
Fun fact, courtesy of the 33rd team social media account, A.J. Brown tied the record for most games with at least 125 receiving yards in a row with 5.
Next up, Josh, Dolphins versus Patriots. Spread here's Dolphins -10. Totals 47 points. I said this last week. The Dolphins offense is for real. I'm not going to take anything away from them, but they've beat up bad teams and struggled against quality defenses. The first 2 were the Patriots when they were healthy in Buffalo. This time they got a common opponent, and the Eagles defense pretty much shut their offense down for the most part. Think everything's fine long term, but one thing that I think we have to talk about here, Josh, is Jalen Waddle's been pretty disappointing to this far. You take a guy in the 2nd round, he's been a middling performer to this point. Tyreek Hill's been going crazy. That's part of the reason. Is there anything encouraging with Jalen Waddle's usage?
So I think what's encouraging is that 4 of 6 games, his target share has been at least 29%. That's incredibly high. It's a very good pass offense. He's been targeted on at least 33% of his routes each of the past 3 games. So essentially every 3 routes he's getting targeted. That's very, very good. That makes me feel like big games are coming. But you might say, okay, so why are you not a little more excited? Ultimately, it's the schedule. We've kind of gone back and forth trying to decide. Obviously, it's not a positive that they have a tough schedule, but just trying to figure out how do we balance. We love this Dolphins offense in terms of big play potential, in terms of week-to-week fantasy point upside with the schedule. Ultimately, they have 9 remaining games for the fantasy season. 6 of those 9 games are Patriots, Chiefs, the Jets twice, the Cowboys, the Ravens. That is kind of why I would say at this point, Jalen Waddle is more of a hold. I don't want to play schedule police here, but like you've said before, it's been one of the easiest schedules in the NFL in terms of wide receiver production. Waddle hasn't quite hit there yet. The peripherals are strong enough that I think the fantasy production will improve in terms of how much. I am still a little bit skeptical at the end of the day that he is going to be returning 2nd round fantasy value these next 9 weeks.
As J. Larky tweets, his rest of season rankings and trade calculator will be updated on Wednesday this week. Look for his fantasy rankings tomorrow, along with Kev Wheeler and Matthew Hill. Let's see if they have a consensus on Jalen Waddle up against the Patriots this week. Josh, speaking of the Patriots, Mac Jones has been a tale of 2 quarterbacks to this point in the season. He's actually played reasonably well in 3 games, obviously bombed in a number of others. Bailey Zappi, when you're even mentioning the phrase quarterback controversy, when Bailey Zappi is your competition, you're not exactly, and you don't have a ton of job security in that spot, Josh. And like we said, the thing that's odd about Mac Jones' spike games is they've come against the Eagles, the Dolphins, and the Bills. It's kind of peculiar to me. You'd think like, maybe you shred the cupcakes you play, but he's done well against 3, actually at least 2 good defenses. I think the Dolphins, we still got to treat them as a middle of the pack group. But at the end of the day, Josh, one thing that I'll always say about Mac Jones is the Patriots offense has lacked firepower his whole career here. Speaking of, Ramondre Stevenson was very productive last year. He's been extremely disappointing this year. Ezekiel Elliott's bitten into his workload big time. What's your season-long outlook on Ramondre Stevenson?
I think Ramondre Stevenson is some type of committee back in a terrible offense. If we look at Ramondre versus Zeke this year, Ramondre 1.6 red zone carries a game, Zeke 1.3. We do not like that split. Goal line carries, Ezekiel Elliott actually has more goal line carries this year than Ramondre Stevenson. Yards per carry is 3.1 for Ramondre to 3.7 for Zeke. Everyone out there saying that Zeke is so washed behind the same offensive line with a close enough amount of carries per game has actually been about 25% more efficient than Ramondre Stevenson. And then the receiving usage, which was supposed to be why you were drafting Ramondre, he's now had 10 or fewer receiving yards in 4 of 7 games. I think Ramondre in good matchups is a low-end fantasy RB2. I mean, we saw Ryan, right? Great usage this past week. I think it was 12.5 fantasy points. That simply does not get me excited. If that feels like a ceiling game, I think it's time that we start thinking about Ramondre Stevenson a little bit like some of the other players that everyone loves to hate, like a Najee Harris. Ramondre Stevenson, for some reason, because of this quote-unquote receiving workload, has a little bit of luster remaining, and I would definitely be looking to sell him for most other fantasy RB2 types coming off of this very, very surprising upset win over the Bills. Before we keep going, guys, if you like Ryan's work, follow him at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. He's watched every snap of every game since 2014. He lives to tell about it. We like him for that. He's got his power rankings dropping tomorrow on the site, and he's got his expert picks and predictions dropping Thursday for every single game for the Week 8 slate.
So far, so good on surviving through watching all these games, Josh. And, to be honest, watching Ramondre Stevenson snaps this year hasn't really helped me in that endeavor. Next up, Cowboys versus Rams. Cowboys are 6.5-point home favorites. Totals 45 points here. Dallas is a top 5 roster. Micah Parsons likely lost ground to both Myles Garrett and TJ Watt in the Defensive Player of the Year race, but still, he headlines one of the league's best defenses. Dak Prescott, when he faced the Chargers on Monday night a couple weeks ago, Dak Prescott had a great game in pressure management in that contest. The thing here is, though, Josh, we talk about this all the time. Dallas is a great roster. We just mentioned that. CeeDee Lamb, et cetera. Tony Pollard's even had great usage. But would you call his production underwhelming to date?
So through Week 7, Tony Pollard's averaged 16 carries and 5 targets a game. We should love that for fantasy. My expected fantasy points model that looks at usage has him as a nearly 18 fantasy point per game running back, 18, but he's actually scored just over 15 points this year. So right there, it feels like he's underperforming. But then when we look at the advanced metrics, which Pollard can control, because he can't really control, quote unquote, like usage in a way, that's sort of what they're giving him. But when they give him touches, he's forced to miss tackle once every 50 carries. Oof. He's broken a tackle once every 33 carries. Ooh. The prior 2 seasons, forcing missed tackles 1 in 15 carries, breaking tackles 1 in 10. If that was too many numbers for you, he has essentially avoided tackles at a 3 times worse rate, 3 times worse than he did over the 2021 and 2022 seasons. When we look at his pass game usage, it's a similar thing. He's been targeted on 28% of his routes this year. The past 2 years, it was 26%, 26, 28, basically the same number. The real big thing is that his yards per route run has plummeted this year, despite his catch rate going up massively. He's catching 86% of his targets this year, way better than he ever has at any point in his career. Yet, when you look at his routes run and his receiving yardage, it's super low. Essentially, he's just not creating in space when he's running the ball or when he's receiving the ball. And we actually talked about this extensively during the offseason, and I kept saying, I'm just a little bit worried about thrusting Tony Pollard into being like the RB4 in fantasy, simply because we hadn't seen him do it. I know you'd mentioned a few times that anytime Pollard's been nicked up in his career, he doesn't look quite as explosive. And I think we're ultimately seeing that right now, that if a guy is getting 21 opportunities per game, when he hasn't really gotten more than about 15 in prior seasons, you can often expect an efficiency decline. And with Pollard, it's kind of cratered essentially, where he almost looks like a grinder back. And this is all with that broken 80-yard play that he had against the Chargers. Even with that, the efficiency across the board is still terrible. So if he didn't have that one random 80-yard broken play from this past week, it was looking significantly more bleak.
That's Jay Larky tweets. And yes, Josh, you were definitely below consensus on Tony Pollard heading into the year. And so far, your stances are the reality of the situation currently. Next up for the Rams in this contest, the bottom line is this is a very well-coached team with a Hall of Fame quarterback. And I'll admit this too. They have a good they have a good trio of wide receivers. Tyler Higbee's a solid tight end. Puka Nacua once again, big game. I like this matchup in this one, but again, 150 yards receiving, just gotta hand it to the guy. He's crushing it, man. He's crushing it. Everything else aside from Aaron Donald, though, is closer to a vulnerability than a strength for the Rams. They've been overachieving to this point. Schedule gets a little harder now. That said, Josh, a big thing for fantasy players here is, can you make sense out of this Rams backfield with Kyren Williams on the sideline?
So Kyren Williams just went on injured reserve. Originally, it was such a minor high ankle sprain. He was probably going to miss a week, and now he's on injured reserve. And then we have backup Ronnie Rivers, who is going to miss about 4 weeks with the sprained PCL. They already got rid of Cam Akers. We're getting really, really thin here. They ultimately signed Darrell Henderson off the street. And somehow this is now looking like a fantasy RB2 or better for the next few weeks. When we look at this past week, it was the Darrell Henderson show with Royce Freeman in tow. Carries were 18 to 12 in Henderson's favor over Freeman. Henderson had the red zone and the goal line carry, and he had the red zone target, and he ran twice as many routes. That type of usage, we should expect Darrell Henderson to score about 70% of the backfield's fantasy points each week. A lot of these backfields have about 18 to 25 fantasy points a week in their potential. So if you're getting 70% of that, then we're looking at pretty strong numbers, 14, 15, 16 fantasy points a game. I think if anything, the split would move actually more in Darrell Henderson's favor, given that he hadn't played an NFL game since week 11 of last year. And as I mentioned, was signed off the street. So at this point, Darrell Henderson looking like a great waiver pickup for anyone out there. If he's still on your waiver wire for some reason, we'll have our waiver advice show tomorrow where we can kind of discuss just how high we should go. But I think given what we saw where they just were spoon feeding Kyron Williams carries, I would say that Darrell Henderson looks like a great option. And I'd even say that Royce Freeman's a great bench stash, given that Darrell Henderson struggled with health throughout his career. And again, 18 carries this past week coming off of the street. That cannot feel good on his body.
Reminder to check out Josh's fantasy rankings with Kev Wheeler and Matt Hill. Let's see where they have the Rams running back, both Rams running backs, Freeman and Henderson, ranked. I'll also add this, Josh. We said on our waiver wire show last week that I don't think they're giving Zach Evans a ton of playing time. I don't think they trust him. When you have a pocket passer like Matthew Stafford with an offensive line that's much better than it was last year, but still, we're not exactly talking about the Eagles' offensive line here. You need guys who can block and that are reliable. So I think that's going to continue, at least in the short term myself. Next up, Josh, one of the better games on the docket. You'd think with 16 games we'd have a bunch of barn burners here, but that's not really the case. And, this one's not exactly guaranteed to be a close contest either. The Steelers host the Jaguars. The spread Steelers +2. That's a spread that's going to attract a lot of public money on the Jaguars. And, maybe even rightfully so to a degree. We'll check things out as the week goes on with there. Totals 42 points. Pittsburgh Steelers are a solid football team. Mike Tomlin hasn't had a losing season since he took over as head coach, 15, 16 years ago, Josh? They're a good outfit, plain and simple. Defense continues to be their difference maker. Right now, I think the TJ Watt would be the defensive player of the year if the season ended today. And, to that end, if Jacksonville has one liability on offense, it's their offensive tackle situations, which, handling TJ Watt's a big-time uphill battle. Now for the Steelers... Now for the Steelers offense here, Josh, which, I think it's fair to say they're holding this team back in a lot of ways. We'll talk about if there's any hope here. First up, Pittsburgh came off a bye. Najee Harris had the more significant role over Jalen Warren. Do you have any hope that changes as the season goes on from here?
Ryan, I have very little hope. The snaps were still close, 32-26, barely in Najee Harris's favor. There were 4 red zone carries up for grabs. Najee Harris had 2 of the 4. Warren had 2 of the 4. The Rams came into this game one of the best defenses at limiting running back production through the air. That's really where Jalen Warren has excelled, where he scored in fantasy, was through a fairly elite receiving back role. So if for some reason someone out there is like, oh, the tides have turned, I looked at the box score, I saw the carries, I saw the fantasy points, you can sell Najee Harris at fantasy RB2 prices, and I think you would be profiting quite considerably here. I still would lean Jalen Warren rest of season, simply given that if anything happens to Najee Harris, I think Jalen Warren has pretty immense upside there. So yeah, I didn't see anything to lead me to believe that Najee Harris suddenly the workhorse of 2 years ago.
I like that smart stuff, Josh. Pickett's passing attack wasn't eye-popping, but it was better. Do you have any enthusiasm for this group, especially with Deontay Johnson back?
So Pickett had 230 pass yards. We don't get excited about that.
No.
But we do get excited that he did it on 25 attempts. That's more than 9 yards per pass attempt. That was a season high by a considerable margin. This was actually the first time all season that George Pickens and Deontay Johnson played a full game together. Pat Freiermuth barely played due to injury. The next 2 games are actually quite nice. We've got Jacksonville and then the Titans. Those are both plus matchups for the pass catchers. And then the final 3 games of 2023, we're actually co-authoring a piece about preparing for the fantasy playoffs. Their final 3 games are the Colts, the Bengals, and the Seahawks. Those are 3 solid matchups for the pass catchers during the fantasy playoffs. I'd assume Pat Fryermuth is back by then. We're still not super enthusiastic about Pickett in a vacuum for fantasy, more of a streaming option, but maybe we stream him all 3 of those final weeks of the season. And I think Deontay Johnson, we know what we're getting. Massive target earner, one of the best in the NFL at that. And then Pickens himself has actually taken some nice strides in the target earning department, despite being a downfield clasher with his archetype of receiver. So I'd say that overall, I'm becoming more bullish once again on the Steelers.
I like it, Josh. I like it. The Jaguars. Their pass rush had an impact against the Saints' banged up offensive line. I know Nick has them in the Jaguars defense in his waiver wire column this week because the Steelers' offensive line isn't exactly a beacon of reliability themselves. But, can we say any more about Trevor Lawrence last week, Josh? He played on a short week with a knee injury. Not only did he ball out a little bit, he had 59 yards rushing, I believe the exact number was. It's something I've always wanted to see more of him as a pro. If you remember, in my interview for this company, I brought up Trevor Lawrence's rushing ability. So I was thrilled to see that. And here's the thing, Josh, for the rest of the roster. Travis Etienne has 2 rushing touchdowns in each of his last 3 games. But what might be more encouraging for his long-term prospects is his passing game role. How stable has that been? And can you declare victory on being above consensus on the Etienne already?
I'll declare victory. I think is this my first victory declare of the season? We're 7 weeks in. Victory declared. Travis Etienne officially looks like a good fantasy pick. Last year's target share was 8%. This year it's 12%. Some people out there have been making fun of that. Like, oh, he's only 12%. Guys, 8 divided by 2 is 4. 8 plus 4 is 12. We are looking at a 50% target share increase from last season. He's had 3 or more receptions in 6 of 7 games this year. He's had 5 targets in more than half of his games this year. I ultimately think that if you're getting a guy that gets a lot of carries and he's the goal line back in an offense that we like, and he has a good pass game role, and he's extremely explosive, looks like a top 5 fantasy running back rest of season, victory lapped.
Question 2 about the Jaguars offense, Josh. A little bit more of a darker question here. Calvin Ridley has been wildly inconsistent. Do you think that continues?
I think it probably does. He has a career low catch rate of 56%. For those thinking that surely has to regress to the mean, whatever you think his mean might be, just know that he has by far the highest average target depth on the team. It's nearly 50% higher than Christian Kirk. It's significantly higher than Evan Engram. Zay Jones has been operating moderately downfield when healthy, but he's barely played this year. Generally, we like if a guy's getting a lot of targets and down the field. The problem is that he's not getting a lot of targets. Christian Kirk and Evan Engram have higher target shares this year than Calvin Ridley. I certainly would not sell him after week 7 where he had 1 catch for 5 yards, but I think I would definitely consider selling him if he has a good game this week against the Jaguars or against the Steelers, who have actually allowed quite a few big fantasy performances to opponents, simply because I think the inconsistency continues, where he kind of feels like this fringe fantasy wide receiver 2 rest of season at this point.
Next up, Colts versus Saints. Colts are 1.5 point home favorites. Totals 43.5. I think the biggest surprise of the week 7 slate was the Colts offensive performance against Cleveland. Colts had a similar macro game plan that I would have deployed. Very run heavy game plan, had some decent success. And the reason for that is, if you're facing a premium pass defense that has a premium pass rush and you have a pretty good offensive line yourself, you want to get guys like Myles Garrett worried about run fits. Both Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss had 18 carries apiece, so that's pretty significant volume on the ground. Do you think that's the reality going forward? Are they going to split in that kind of ratio?
So the 2 of them have shared the field for 3 games this year. This was the first game where Jonathan Taylor was more efficient as a runner and a receiver than Zach Moss. Remember that he did have some kind of injury to the ankle. He might have had a back spasm. I'm not quite sure, but whatever it is, it looks like he's fully reacclimated. It's the efficient Jonathan Taylor show last week against a good Browns defense. What I really want to see is the Colts in week 8 against the Saints. If Jonathan Taylor doesn't widen the split pretty dramatically, then I'm going to be inclined to think this is a committee rest of season in some form. Maybe you're hoping for 60-40 in Taylor's favor. I really think if we're not seeing a 65-70% touch split in Taylor's favor this upcoming week, then yes, I would say this looks like a rest of season committee, unfortunately.
Yeah, I like that. The one thing I'll add to that is, I think the one hope we can have, because I think it makes sense waiting a week to make a decision on this one, is if Moss has kind of played too well for them to just, take him off the field. So he had, like you said, Taylor was better than him this week. If that continues against the Saints, maybe we see a bit of a spike after that. Now, the passing attack, Josh, again, Gardner Minshew threw for over 300 yards. He didn't even do it on a lot of attempts either against Cleveland's pass defense that, shut down the 49ers, shut down the Bengals. So big time surprise. I individually watched every one of Gardner Minshew's passes again today after watching the game yesterday. Coverage breakdown on Downs' 59-yard touchdown. It looked like the corner thought he had safety help. He did not. Downs had 2 other 20-yard receptions that came off play extensions from Gardner Minshew. All the credit in the world to Minshew on those. Jonathan Taylor had a great run on a screen and caught a drop-in throw on a wheel route. Both of those, 38 yards. Alec Pierce had 38 yards on a stop fade type throw to, harken back to the John Madden days. He'd call them stop fades. On a free play, Michael Pittman busted a 75-yard score, broke a tackle. Then the second defender bumped off him and kind of like this isn't going to happen. If you run this play 100 times, this only happens this one time. But, freak play. I'd call it a mix of Gardner Minshew was actually genuinely really, really good in this contest, but most of his yardage was driven by 5-6 plays. Now to that end, Josh, at the end of the day, Gardner Minshew still lit up the Cleveland Browns defense. Do you have any takeaways from this passing attack?
Yeah, I think Minshew remains just kind of a potential streamer in certain weeks, depending on matchup. Maybe that changes after this Browns game. Maybe there's more confidence in him. Maybe they let it rip. I mean, if you're averaging well over 10 yards per pass attempt against what looked like maybe the NFL's best pass defense through the first month and a half, that's obviously encouraging. For fantasy, I think we can just start Michael Pittman and Josh Downs each week. They have 28 and 22% target shares respectively with Minshew this year. They're each averaging nearly 2 yards per route run with him as well, which is a very strong number. Teams that struggle against outside receivers, we should like Pittman a little bit more. Teams that struggle against the slot, we should like Downs a little bit more. And I think after this week, I might have been wrong saying Josh Downs looks like mostly a PPR option, given that I know one thing you really liked about him coming out of college was that he has elite speed, especially for some of these slot receivers where you're like, oh, it's just the guy's just running slants and he's fast enough to beat the slot corner. That's about it. No, Josh Downs has legitimate speed. And I think we kind of saw it on display this past week. So at this point, Pittman's still in the fantasy wide receiver 2 conversation. Josh Downs, I'd say, is in the fantasy wide receiver 3 conversation, as in slightly higher end, maybe wide receiver 28 type a lot of these weeks. And for what's happened this season, that is very, very, very welcome for our fantasy teams.
And for the Saints, Josh, we talked about this going into Thursday night. The Saints were down both offensive tackles. I don't think either of us would mistake Derek Carr for Peyton Manning. But the truth of the matter is the checkdowns in the short passing game wasn't unexpected. We talked about betting crazy reception totals on Alvin Kamara, which we probably should have done, but we ran out of time, unfortunately. I think Carr's taken a bit too much flack for that in that game. I think it was just, when you're down in your third and fourth string offensive tackles and you're playing Trayvon Walker and Josh Allen, who are 2 top 10 picks, dynamic athletes, like it's part of football, man. Sometimes you just have to be more conservative. Now that end, Josh, what do you think about Derek Carr in general and for fantasy purposes?
I think he's been fine in general. Looks a lot like Andy Dalton last year in terms of what the production, which we talked about a lot this offseason, which was essentially the highs of Derek Carr are higher than Dalton. But week to week, you're probably looking at a similar Saints offense to last year, which a lot of people didn't like. And again, it seems like they don't like it this year. We're going to back into how I think the touchdown rate improves for Derek Carr. So the Saints offense has thrown 31 times in the red zone, and they've run 22 times. That's a split that favors passing, but not by that much. But then once you get closer, 22 end zone pass attempts this year, just 7 goal line carries. That's where you really see the split actually widen dramatically. Carr's touchdown rate is about half what it's been for his career. If we look at the last 2 weeks, for example, he's thrown the ball 105 times for 654 passing yards, and he's only thrown 2 passing touchdowns. Career averages would suggest he should have had 4 instead of 2. And then we back into the math and we say, okay, he's averaged 17 fantasy points a game the past 2 weeks. If you give him an extra passing touchdown each week just to get him to his career average, it goes from 17 to 21 fantasy points a game. It's kind of what we've been saying, that in the right matchups, Derek Carr is a fantasy viable streamer. And I wouldn't let these last 2 weeks where the fantasy points didn't match the passing yards dissuade you from continuing to view him as a streamer.
I like it, Josh. Sounds like regression to the mean paired with a matchup against a vulnerable Colts secondary. Maybe we'll craft some bets on that as the week progresses, Josh. Now, question number 2 related to the Saints offense. Alvin Kamara's role has been crazy. Now that Jamal Williams is back, do you think they reduce Kamara's workload some, particularly on the ground?
I think they might reduce it a little bit, but I would definitely not be selling Alvin Kamara. Jamal Williams returning just kind of neutered Kendre Miller. Ultimately, Kamara had 17 carries. Jamal Williams had 5. Kamara had 6 of the 7 red zone carries. He had all 3 goal line carries. He ran 39 routes in this game. Jamal Williams ran 7. I think as the offensive line gets healthier, we should expect maybe slightly fewer Kamara dump offs because Carr has more time to get through his progressions. But ultimately, I don't know why in the state of the running back position as it is today, would we be selling a bona fide fantasy RB1 like Alvin Kamara?
Titans versus Falcons, Josh. Titans +1, home favorite, or home underdogs, rather. Another gruesome 37-point game total on the slate. Ryan Tannehill's unlikely to play. Titans just traded away Kevin Byard, which, when you have a vulnerable secondary and you trade the one bright spot of it, things are, that's a vulnerable group that we want to target going forward. And then, maybe the big dogs next, maybe DeAndre Hopkins next. Regardless, seems like the Titans may be waving the white flag a little bit here with the Byard trade. With that in mind, Josh, say Tennessee trades Derrick Henry. We've talked about Tajay Spears, back in the offseason when we had Mike Tannenbaum on. We like Tajay Spears. If you can get him cheap, I think that's in your best interest. But here's probably the ugliest question of the day, Josh. What do we do with this offense with Malik Willis or Will Levis at quarterback?
We'll start a little more optimistic and then we'll get pessimistic. Optimistically, if Will Levis starts and DeAndre Hopkins isn't traded, I think he's a fantasy wide receiver 2. We talked about it a few weeks now where backup quarterbacks they take a long time to read the defense. They're really going to want to target the wide receiver 1. So while efficiency generally goes way down, the actual target volume is pretty good. And we've actually seen Hopkins in this role for most of his career where he's playing in kind of bad offensive environments, just getting force-fed targets. Produces in fantasy. I think that's what you get with Will Levis. Malik Willis is doomsday, where you literally cannot start a single pass catcher from the Titans. Willis started 3 games last year. He had under 100 passing yards in all 3 starts. That has to be one of the craziest stats out there, is that a guy started 3 NFL games at quarterback when he was a college quarterback and has yet to hit 100 yards in a game. He was sacked about 1 in 7 dropbacks last year. That's Justin Fields-esque. We do not like that. He actually had pretty good yards per attempt this past week, or I guess 2 weeks ago prior to the bye when he filled in for Tannehill. The issue is that he was sacked 4 times on those 9 dropbacks. I really have nothing positive to say about Malik Willis. Should he start? We should not start any Titans pass catcher, literally no matter what, because again, we have yet to see the guy hit 100 yards in a game.
Sounds made up, Josh, but unfortunately it's not. We just mentioned with Byard out, the Titans' already vulnerable secondary could be the worst in the league now. Falcons' offensive line can mitigate Tennessee's front, which is the strength of their defense. None of us really wants to start Desmond Ridder in fantasy football, but if you're in dire straits, he has a sneaky, solid matchup in this game. That said, Josh, no one really cares about the Falcons' passing attack right now. What we want to know is what on earth happened with Bijan Robinson on Sunday, and what do we make of it going forward? You're on mute.
Wow. Looks like Bijan Robinson had a migraine. I might give Ryan migraines if I keep muting myself on these podcasts. I would have liked some transparency from Arthur Smith that the migraine was happening, but I'm actually not concerned. Some people are kind of like, Arthur Smith hates your fantasy team. This is the worst thing ever. Migraines were not an issue for Bijan Robinson at Texas that I'm aware of. So I think this was just as unlucky as it gets that he had the migraine last minute and Arthur Smith happened to be his coach. I am not reading into this at all. If it were to happen again, that might become a problem. For right now, I'm going to assume that this was a wrong place, wrong time thing, that the migraine happened the day before the game and his head coach happened to be Arthur Smith.
Let me ask you the follow-up question here, Josh. If you're in a home league with more casual players, are you trying to steal Bijan Robinson right now? Or are you still a little scared?
I would definitely try to steal him. I think if you can start to offer up someone that is a slightly lower end fantasy RB1 rest of season, like a DeAndre Swift, if you could flip Swift for Bijan, something like that, I would most certainly take that deal. I think one you could probably get that I would lean towards is trade away Breece Hall, get Bijan Robinson. I think you could do that as well. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could potentially leverage this situation where people are livid. I know some sports books were even refunding Bijan Robinson bets because of how frustrated everyone was. He had 1 carry for 3 yards. I would look to be a buyer, just again, given we didn't really see this issue when he played at Texas.
Yeah, no, same boat, Josh. I've seen some big time overreactions in some spots over the past few days, so I'm a buyer too on Bijan if I can get him at the right price. Packers versus Vikings. Packers are minus or 1 point home favorites. Totals 42 here. You know, Josh, some Packer fans wanted life without Aaron Rodgers. Here we are. We go to Denver, lose to the Broncos. That's life without Aaron Rodgers. Green Bay's defense has played reasonably well this year, but at this point, should we treat Green Bay's offense as one of the worst offenses in the league, or at least one of the least reliable offenses in the league?
I would say yes. First off, the good defense from the Packers is going to be kind of a negative to their offense's fantasy points at times. I think they're going to be inclined to slow the game down more, try and give a little less to Jordan Love, take things off his plate. Christian Watson looks like he's going to be out for at least the next month with a knee injury. It was non-contact. It's probably a knee sprain. Could be worse. And then Jordan Love himself has been under 7 yards per pass attempt in every single week aside from week 1. He's completing under 58% of his passes this year. I do not have many good things at all to say about Jordan Love at this point. David Bakhtiari, star left tackles out for the year. It's looking very, very bleak. Let's treat them like a bottom 10 offense.
Speaking of other guys that Josh isn't a big fan of, Josh hates Alexander Mattison and plays the bet against him for Monday Night Football in our free Discord. My Twitter handle is Ryan Reynolds at NFL, at Ryan Reynolds NFL, that is. It's the link to our free Discord's my pinned tweet. Bet against Alexander Mattison with Josh Larky. Now, Josh, the Vikings. If you asked me if I wanted Kirk Cousins or Derek Prescott for one game, it would be an extremely difficult decision where this season I might actually lean Kirk Cousins. That said, the offense isn't the same without Justin Jefferson. While that isn't a surprise, this group went from a top 5 passing attack to more of a middle-of-the-road unit. So, you know, the Vikings play tonight against San Francisco. Tall order for them. Is there anything you're looking for in that matchup?
I'm just curious if the offense will look fundamentally different in what is now game 2 without Justin Jefferson. It's a long week for them playing on Monday Night Football. Week 6 was just not very good. They scored 19 points against the Bears. 7 of those points were a scoop and score touchdown by the defense. So really they did next to nothing against the Bears in that game. What I would expect is TJ Hawkinson gets 25 to 30% of the targets once again, probably 15 to 20% apiece for KJ Osborne and Jordan Addison. I would expect all three to be relatively inefficient, given that the 49ers are a good pass defense, and also that what we see with, like, if we think about compared to running backs, when a star running back gets hurt and the backup comes in, the fantasy production, the efficiency is often similar enough because they're just gifted volume and the run game so dependent on offensive line, run scheme. Whereas with pass catchers, a lot of that really is player talent. And when Justin Jefferson's in there, he's taking on a lot more defensive attention. The top cornerback will guard him more often. Now we have Jordan Addison attracting that attention. I don't think he's ready for this. So I'm expecting poor efficiency. We'll see if Addison can at least be more efficient than Osborne. Osborne was actually more efficient than him last week. And then with Alexander Mattison, my favorite player in the NFL, will he be a bell cow again? He had 18 of the 19 carries last week. I believe he had 6, if not 7 targets. The Niners have shut down running backs each of the last few seasons. I would expect a pretty inefficient game for Alexander Mattison. And ultimately, if for some reason he gets a lot of work in this game again, I would certainly be looking to sell him. Not the type of running back that's probably going to hold up throughout the rest of the year. And a guy that's been such a liability, leaving fantasy points on the table. Cannot tell you how many times he's dropped passes in the red zone, fumbled in the red zone this season. Alexander Mattison, certifiably not a very good starting NFL running back.
Next up, Seahawks versus Browns. Seahawks are 2.5-point home favorites. Game total is 40 points. You know, the Seahawks defense has only given up 26 points over their last 3 games. The Seahawks offense showed some ceiling in wins against Detroit and Carolina. In particular, their overtime win against the Lions is you know, that's encouraging because that's a playoff team. But generally speaking, I'd call this group an underachieving one to this point in the season. That said, Josh, you saw Jackson Smith-Njigba spike week come in early last week. And, it did to a degree. It's definitely his best game as a pro to this point. Give us your thoughts on JSN through 7 weeks.
Yeah, I can't take too much credit for this, given that we had the conflating factor of DK Metcalf as a surprising rule out yesterday. But when we look at Smith-Njigba's actual routes that he's running, the average depth of target was below 5 yards per target the first 4 games. Then in game 5, it was 7.5 yards. That's a lot bigger than 3-4 yards. Then yesterday, it was 10 yards downfield on average. His target share was a season high 29% last week. That's good. That actually led the team. He had 2 more targets than Tyler Lockett. I expect Metcalf back this next week. I think JSN is a matchup-specific fantasy starter when the big 3 are healthy, unfortunately. Probably a flex type generally. And then fantasy wide receiver 2 if Metcalf or Lockett ever miss a game. We still cannot get too excited ultimately about Smith-Njigba. If someone thinks this is what they're going to get rest of season, then as crazy as it sounds, we should sell the first wide receiver off the board in this most recent NFL draft.
For the Browns, I'm very curious to see how they're going to play defense in this matchup. Very curious on that. It's one of the things I'm looking forward to most this week. But I want to talk about their offense from last week because this did not look like a 39-point effort. I'm going to run through what happened real quick. Team barely had 300 total yards of offense. Ford broke a big run early for a long score. Cleveland had a defensive score. Dustin Hopkins had 4 field goals on drives that totaled 57 yards in total. 4 drives, 57 yards, 12 points. 3 of those were 50-plus yard field goals. This is not sustainable to be, you can't be a winning team with this kind of offense. And as we saw, Deshaun Watson got hurt early, got pulled for PJ Walker. This is probably the most confusing offense in the league for me right now. Do you have any insights on it?
I think if we just zoom out from a macro perspective, it's not very good for fantasy. You've got a great defense paired on the other side. The offense has a great offensive line with not a lot of quarterback play. That's not what you want. You don't want the defense generally limiting opponents, and then the offense just kind of relying on some type of committee rushing attack with the offensive line. Deshaun Watson re-injured his shoulder. He's also, I believe, in the concussion protocol. Nice little double whammy for him right there. PJ Walker, to his credit, has been terrible the past 2 weeks. He's completed exactly 50% of his passes these past 2 weeks. He's been under 200 passing yards in each game. It's hard for me to get excited. If you're telling me that the passing will be anemic, the defense will usually limit opponents. I think the Colts game was an outlier. And then that the rushing attack is generally going to be some kind of pretty 50-50 type committee now that there's no Nick Chubb, and that it's going to be some kind of combination of maybe Jerome Ford might have a high ankle sprain, but even if he has a high ankle sprain, then it's Kareem Hunt and Pierre Strong likely splitting a good chunk of work as well. So I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic here. And I think it might be time to sell Amari Cooper. Last week was bad, but 2 weeks ago he had the big game. And I just do not like that Sean Watson has been continually ineffective this year and is now dealing with 2 more injuries coming out of week 7.
That's Jay Larky tweets. Next up, Broncos versus Chiefs. Broncos are 8-point favorites. Totals 46.5. Denver's defense now played 2 games in a row, including 2 weeks ago against the Chiefs when they only gave up 19 points on Thursday night. The offense was the better unit through those first 5 games. Very confusing team, very unreliable team. Not exactly sure how to treat them in this matchup. You have any thoughts on Denver?
Well, Javonte Williams was a workhorse this past week. He had 15 of the 23 running back carries. He led the team with 12 routes run. That was the first time all year that a Broncos running back led the team in carries and routes. So I think we can at least have a little bit of optimism there. I wouldn't, in trade talks, I still wouldn't value him as anything more than kind of a fringe top 20, top 25 fantasy option at running back, since we don't really like this offense that much. And because it's been such a ping pong effort in terms of who's actually getting the usage in the running back room. But at the very least, positively, we are encouraged by the Javonte Williams usage.
For the Chiefs, Josh, every week in my power rankings, I have some people that complain to me about having them too high. And, here's the thing. KC's given up 15 points a game. That's 3rd in the league, depending on what San Francisco does tonight. They're the defending champs and winners of the last 4 Super Bowls. Patrick Mahomes has been the starter for the Chiefs for 5 full seasons. This is his 6th. The Chiefs have gone to the AFC Championship in every single one of those seasons. Mahomes threw for 424 yards last week. He's tied for the league in touchdown passes. The Chiefs are, they deserve the benefit of the doubt more than anyone else in the league, and I think that should be kind of an obvious thing. Josh, what are your thoughts on Kansas City's offense after a big game against the Chargers?
I think I've seen enough at this point. Travis Kelce is very far removed from the early hyperextended knee that he had right before week 1. I think he might be getting a little bit of a moral ego boost from dating Taylor Swift. Yeah. And I would say that at this point, he is now the tight end 1 by a wide margin again in fantasy, just like last season. I would certainly want to buy high on Travis Kelce after what I saw last week and just looking around the league at the state of the tight end position. I think right now we kind of have Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey, depending on how week 8 goes, maybe Jamar Chase is kind of this big 3 in fantasy in terms of what I'd project moving forward. And I think there's a case that Travis Kelce is now becoming the 4th most valuable player in fantasy.
Next up, Josh, Cardinals versus Ravens. Spread here is Cardinals are 8.5-point home underdogs. Total's 44 points. Arizona scored 19 points over the last 2 weeks. That came against Seattle and the Rams. Like we just said before, the Seahawks have a pretty good defense, but we're not exactly talking about the 85 Bears here. That means, with 3 games in a row now, the Cardinals are playing like the team we expected heading into the season. Do you have any positive notes on Arizona's offense, at least until Kyler Murray returns?
I would just try and buy Marquise Brown this week. I think this is the final week the window's open. Reports I'm reading, Kyler Murray's probably returning for week 9. You're not going to be able to get Marquise Brown ahead of week 9 because all the reports are going to say he's getting Kyler back, and everyone's going to say, well, before I sell, I want to see a week with the two of them together. This is your week, folks. This is your last week. Been recommending it for a few weeks now. And week 8, officially, I think the final time that this window is going to be open.
I agree, Josh. I like Hollywood. I'm on Hollywood myself. On the Ravens side of things, they're giving up the fewest points in the league this season. We've grown accustomed to the Ravens having an excellent defense. It's not a surprise. I've talked a lot about Todd Monken's offense this season. I was far less impressed than most of the first 7 weeks because I actually watch all the games. Throwing for 225 yards or less every week isn't exactly impressive to me. I get that he's efficient, but this is Lamar Jackson we're talking about here. This is a guy who's won the MVP. Now, we finally got the ceiling game against Detroit. Lamar Jackson murdered the Detroit Lions in the air. If this is, and we've talked about this, that Monken's offense, the more pass-centric offense, was an investment in the future. We just saw them blow the absolute doors off a potential playoff team. On top of that, Jackson wasn't really relying on any one receiver at all. He spread the ball around a lot. Do you expect that to continue?
I don't really expect that to continue. I think the Odell Beckham Jr. spike was mostly random. That's what we get with the receiver position. Sometimes they have good weeks. He still ran 30% fewer routes than both Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers yesterday for week 7. If we look at Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers, this now marks the 4th straight game that each of them individually had at least a 21% target share. The players to be interested in here for fantasy, obviously Lamar Jackson, and then Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews. I would not be particularly interested in Odell Beckham, hoping that the 31-year-old can have massive efficiency with Lamar Jackson, who, as you mentioned, has often thrown for around 200 yards in a lot of these contests. I think if someone out there is very excited about Odell on your bench, give them Odell for something in return that you might actually be able to use week to week in fantasy football.
That's Jay Larky tweets. Up next, 49ers versus Bengals. The 49ers are currently 5.5-point favorites. That could change based on the results of tonight. Total's 45.5 points. Like we said, we'll see about the 49ers tonight. They have some injuries, though. Deebo Samuel's out tonight. Trent Williams is doubtful. Christian McCaffrey is apparently going to grit through an oblique injury. Do you have any concerns or thoughts heading into tonight?
I think it's malpractice that Christian McCaffrey is going to be playing in this game. The Vikings are an opponent. I wouldn't say that it's a cakewalk, but it's definitely a very, 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 very winnable matchup for the 49ers. Christian McCaffrey, with his injury history, with how important he is to this team, I would have simply let Jordan Mason and Elijah Mitchell handle this one. And then, assuming that there's nothing weird happens tonight, Brandon Ayuk will be moving up my rest of season rankings and trade value chart that hits the site on Wednesdays for free on the 33rdteam.com. Deebo Samuel has a fracture in his shoulder. He's missing at least 2 weeks. He's already been outproduced this year by Brandon Ayuk. I'd say that Ayuk looks like a borderline top 12 fantasy option at receiver rest of season. And I'll actually be talking about Ayuk with Ian Miller at dynasty_IM on Twitter. On our Dynasty show, it'll be returning for its monthly edition in season Wednesday of this week, late afternoon. He will be one of about a dozen players that we discuss in terms of how their dynasty value has either been improving or the opposite, declining based on what we've seen through 7 weeks.
So for the Bengals, they got to 3-3 heading into their bye week. They have San Francisco and Buffalo over the next 2 weeks. So 3-5 is on the table, but they're still very much in the mix. And if they get in, they're as dangerous as anyone. But more importantly, Burrow looked good and mobile in his last 2 games before the bye week. Jamar Chase is still a premium weapon. You have any thoughts on the Bengals?
So in 2021, Jamar Chase shows up. The Bengals take the NFL by storm. Burrow had 8 air yards per pass attempt, 7th in the NFL. Last year, it became a little more conservative, a little more reliant on yards after the catch for the receivers, and Joe Burrow falls from 7th to 21st among qualified quarterbacks in air yards per attempt at 6.8. This year, it is not 8. It is not 6.8. It is down to 5.9. He's under 6 air yards per attempt. That is 31st among 32 qualified quarterbacks this year. And I think in many ways, that's the root of their struggles, is that they're not really stretching the field as much as they have in past years. And I think it becomes pretty difficult to run an explosive offense with big plays if you're not throwing the ball deep downfield. So right there, I think that's kind of the one concern in terms of, is Joe Burrow back? We'll see in week 8 post-bye, but that's one thing I'll be looking for, is whether or not they have the confidence to push the ball downfield. Some of that's probably the calf injury where his mobility was limited earlier in the season. Part of that might also be that this Bengals offense is just playing really, really conservative, and that they still haven't gotten back to their 2021, 2022 type ceiling.
I agree across the board there. Sunday Night Football. Your Los Angeles Chargers hosting those Chicago Bears. Chargers are 8.5-point home favorites. Totals 46.5 points. That was a disappointing loss on Sunday for the Chargers, Josh. Patrick Mahomes had 300 yards passing in the first half. More concerning is Justin Herbert's offense only scored 17 points. I'm going to move them way down my power rankings when I submit them tonight. My question here for you, Josh, is, and I don't want to hurt your feelings, even though I think I'm going to. I think it's unavoidable here, Josh. This no longer seems like a premium offense since Mike Williams went down. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have any pushback?
Yeah, I already told Ryan before the show not to ask me this question. He decided to ask me this question as a Chargers fan. I'm not panicking, but yeah, they're not a premium pass attack, not a premium offense anymore. They're kind of a fringe top 10 team, no longer the bona fide top 5 team we thought they were to start the season. The first 3 games, Justin Herbert topped 300 passing yards in 2 of those 3. He had 6 pass touchdowns. He didn't throw a pick through those first 3 games. These next 3 games, there's no Mike Williams. All 3 games under 260 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions these past 3 games. And Mike Williams, as we know, stretches the field. And Herbert's air yards per attempt has fallen a full yard from the first 3 games to the next 3 games. Some people out there, oh, that's only 1 yard. That is actually the difference between being top 10 in target distance as a quarterback and bottom 10. So we're starting to look a little bit like that scary Chargers offense last year, where they were not pushing the ball downfield. Remember last year, everyone, Austin Eckler led the team in targets. I don't think that's happening again this year, but the general idea that fantasy points are a little harder to come by when the ball is not getting pushed downfield and when defenses aren't going to respect an offense's ability to do that either.
Fair sort of things, Josh. Their defense has played well 2 weeks in a row now. We could even say 3 if we count Washington, because most of Sam Howell's production came in the second half and a massively surprising negative game script. That said, if Justin Fields misses this contest, that seems like a very, very tall task for the Chicago Bears. The question here, it seems clear to me that the Bears want to run the ball with Tyson Bagent. We can't call him Mr. Bagent anymore now that he's won an NFL game. Do you think Donta Foreman keeps this role long term when Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson return?
I think I'd be a little surprised. This feels kind of like a figure it out reset type year for Chicago. They've got a lot of draft capital coming up. I don't see any reason why you would be playing veteran Donta Foreman heavily over rookie Roschon Johnson or really inexpensive recent 6th round pick Khalil Herbert. So that might bite me. I think Foreman actually played quite well this past week. I watched most of that game, but I still don't expect that usage to continue. I'd say it's borderline malpractice if it does. And one thing that we kind of saw early in the season is that we weren't really that excited about these fantasy running backs, given that when a few of them are healthy, they're all splitting some work. I think Foreman at this point was just better than Darrington Evans, so that we're gifting him a lot of that work. So no, I would, if someone thinks Foreman is now suddenly the rest of season RB1 on this team, I'd push back on that.
I like it, Josh. Follow Josh at JLarky Tweets on Twitter. Now, close out this show, Josh. Monday Night Football. Thankfully, AI granted us with Lions versus Raiders. The Lions are 8-point home favorites. Game total here is 44.5 points. Detroit's a tough, complete team. They're going to be a playoff team, barring anything catastrophic that just got blown out by Baltimore on the road. Now they come back home in prime time against a Raiders team that just lost by 18 points to the aforementioned Tyson Bagent. I think the Raiders are in big trouble here, Josh. And, if you're a survivor pool player, I think if you have Detroit, they're as safe. Nothing's ever completely safe in survivor pools, but I think they're as safe as it gets. Check out my preview that I released earlier today on that. Now, Josh, I think what fantasy players want to know from you is tell us about your stance on Jahmyr Gibbs after last week.
So Jahmyr Gibbs now had his second game where he's playing as the starter with David Montgomery out. It first happened in week 3. Jahmyr Gibbs had 17 carries. He ran 17 routes. The routes were a little underwhelming, but the game script was very much in the Lions' favor. And then week 7, again, Jahmyr Gibbs getting most of the touches when Montgomery's out. But I think, Ryan, could we say this was the absolute dream game script for Jahmyr Gibbs fantasy points, given that they're down 28-0 at the half to the Ravens? Jahmyr Gibbs had 11 carries, 68 rushing yards. That's nice efficiency. He scored a touchdown on the ground. We like that. But ultimately, the reason that he had nearly 30 fantasy points in PPR leagues was 10 targets, catching 9 of them for 58 yards. The 10 targets were on 45 routes, though. His targets per route run or target rate fell about 35% compared to his season average. So as the volume went up, the efficiency and the usage actually went down per touch. I'd say Jahmyr Gibbs at this point, massive performance. Guys, 27 fantasy points. I would either hold or lean a little bit towards sell, given that this was the ideal game script for him. Down 28-0 at the half. And that David Montgomery was out. I would expect most weeks the Detroit Lions will be leading against their opponents. And I would expect David Montgomery to be healthy most weeks. And when they're leading and David Montgomery's healthy, that is a David Montgomery game script. I think the Lions knew this. I think that's partly why Jahmyr Gibbs got so much work, is it was the dream game script with Montgomery potentially returning for this Monday night matchup. Crazy as it sounds, Jahmyr Gibbs, you might want to sell him after his career best performance.
Sharp stuff, Josh. And now, to close this show out on a less enthusiastic note, I think the Raiders are nearly drawn dead here unless Jimmy Garoppolo suits up. And even if he does, they still have a very narrow path to victory here. They're a limited team that has, Max Crosby, Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs, very good Colton Miller, very good core. Everything else gets a little thin. Speaking of Adams and Jacobs, Josh, how worried should we be about both of these guys in fantasy football moving forward?
Josh Jacobs, sell. 17 carries, 5.5 targets a game. That's the best role in fantasy for usage outside of maybe Christian McCaffrey, but only 13.5 fantasy points per game. We don't like that. I don't think this offense looks like it's about to take off. The schedule is starting to get tougher rest of season. He's a massive injury risk given the workload he had last year and the workload that he has this year. The efficiency has been atrocious. He has yet to reach 4 yards per carry in any game this year. More positively, I'd say that Devontae Adams is a hold. You might even want to trade for him potentially. Garoppolo, as you mentioned, there's some chance he returns for this matchup against the Lions. And that's good for Devontae Adams overall and good for the scoring potential of the offense. Adams has a target share that's been at least 27% in all but 2 games. He's actually averaging nearly 17 fantasy points a game. My expected fantasy points model has him at 17 fantasy points a game, which is the 6th highest at the receiver position. The production's been wide receiver 16 per game, not wide receiver 6, but he's only 1 fantasy point behind the wide receiver 11. So we can think that he's been kind of a fringe top 12 type option. I don't think you're getting that back in trades if you get rid of him. So I'd say hold Adams. If someone's trying to sell him for more of a top 15, top 20 price, I'd certainly look to be a buyer here. Since again, really tough schedule that could hurt Josh Jacobs, probably helps Devontae Adams. The Raiders are somehow 3-4 this year, despite a negative 49 point differential I'd expect more trailing game scripts consistently. I'd expect fewer wins. I don't think they win 3 more games rest of season. So Josh Jacobs, sell. Devontae Adams, potentially a buy. And folks, that will do it for us. Make sure that you're following Ryan Reynolds at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. His power rankings hit the site tomorrow. His expert picks and predictions hit the site on Thursday, the33team.com. Those are both free. My fantasy rankings will hit the site tomorrow afternoon, and my rest of season rankings and trade value chart, where you get the new downloadable, gorgeous color-coded PDF to be able to save that to your phone and make those fantasy trades on the fly. That will be coming out on Wednesday. And hop into our free Discord at Ryan Reynolds NFL, at JLarky Tweets. It's linked. The Discord's linked in our profiles. It's linked on all of our articles on the 33team.com. From myself, from Ryan Reynolds, from the 33rd team, from week 7. Thank you, everyone.